afternoon. It's glad to be here. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Ryan. I am a Christian, husband, and father. I live in Northeast Texas, and I'm a third-generation Texan and 13th-generation Southerner. I volunteer as a political activist and troublemaker, and this afternoon I want to talk to you about conservative politics and activism in a post-constitutional America. Now, I'll be saying some controversial things that many of you here may not agree with, may rile you up a little bit, but my purpose here is not to get you to agree with me tonight. My objective is to get you to begin to think and to begin to question what you've been taught about the Constitution, about politics, activism, and in a time such as this. There are no quick fixes or easy answers to the profound trouble we are in. And the very first step on the road to recovery is to face up to the severe poverty of our political paradigms. Now, that being said, we got a lot of ground to cover, and we're going to get started. We've all been conditioned to believe the way back to the good old days is through the Constitution. Want better government? Follow the Constitution. Want lower taxes, more privacy and freedom? Elect constitutional conservatives to office. It's an article of faith with us conservatives that if we could just get back to obeying the Constitution, then most of our political problems would just disappear. But how many of us ever ask, does this seem to be working? What have we actually conserved? Government always seems to grow and consolidate. Rights are perpetually trampled. But the belief in the power of the Constitution to restrain the federal government never seems to waver. I take no pleasure in saying this, but our Constitution, the version of the Constitution we all study about in school and long for in conservative circles, is dead, and we're not going to be able to resurrect it. Now, why do I say it's dead? And we'll start with reason number one, because it sets the stage for all the other reasons. So 8 reasons why the Constitution is dead. Number 1, the people and culture that harbored the values and beliefs reflected in the Constitution are no longer with us. I'm going to pay a quick visit to an 18th century French counter-enlightenment philosopher named Joseph de Maistre. And he's widely known as the author of an essay called The Generative Principle of Political Constitutions. And he makes 4 observations. We're going to look at the first 2. The first one is that the fundamental principles of political constitutions exist before all written law. Fundamental principles of political constitutions exist before all written law. Second, that a constitutional law is and can only be the development or sanction of an unwritten pre-existing right. And what is de Maistre saying? He's saying that the process of writing down laws and formalizing them into a constitution doesn't create something new that can restrain and control men. The Constitution doesn't possess timeless, magical powers to fix what ails us. Any power a Constitution has, it takes from naturally existing laws and beliefs that exist outside of the Constitution, and these laws are always a direct reflection of the character and beliefs of the people that made it. And so a Constitution, in essence, is a cultural snapshot. It's a picture in time of the people's beliefs about laws and rights. And since people change, cultures change, and unfortunately their constitutions change with them. So with this in mind, we're going to take a few minutes and dive into the tension between 2 main camps of the framing era. Help us understand how the Constitution was subverted shortly after it was ratified. And reason number 7. Reason 2. Slide 7. The manipulation of constitutional clauses have permanently gutted the restraining power of the Constitution. So Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson are all recognized as 2 prominent founding fathers, and they represent 2 distinct ideologically opposed camps during the framing era. And the debate that raged between them over the nature, size, and scope of the federal government has set the stage for American political debates ever since. Now, Jefferson, as most of you know, was a proponent of state sovereignty and true American republicanism. He was opposed to central banking, to mercantilism and crony capitalism. He was a fan of the farmer and agriculture. Jefferson believed in the consent of the governed. He wanted decentralized power, minimalist federal government, and strong, sovereign state governments that would voluntarily cooperate by way of compact. And it's been said that when Jefferson looked in between the words of the U.S. Constitution, he saw blank spaces and regarded the Constitution as a restraining chain around the federal government. Now, many of you may know a little of Alexander Hamilton, but you may not know what a conniving scoundrel he was. When Hamilton looked in between those same words, he found a warrant for a national government. Not a federation of republics, mind you, but a true national government and a rubber stamp to greenlight any project he and his fellow nationalists might have envisioned. Now, Hamilton was a vociferous advocate for a European-styled American empire. He wanted a government-controlled central bank to help finance crony capitalism, public debt, and massive infrastructure projects. He wanted a president appointed for a lifetime that could actually veto state legislation and wanted the federal government in control of appointing state governors. Now, long after these two men have passed on, their respective schools have left a lasting imprint on American politics. And as conservatives, when we sit down to study the Constitution, we're always taught the Jeffersonian version. But despite the Jeffersonian version being ratified and approved in Philadelphia, ratified by the states, the political structure that emerged is unmistakably the vision of Alexander Hamilton. So let's talk about how that happened. Members of Hamilton's party were called the Federalists, and at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, they slipped in the General Welfare Clause into the document. In 1791, as Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton used this generic phrase to sanction the very first instance of American corporate welfare. Around that same time, Hamilton expanded the limited meaning of the Commerce Clause to include all commerce within the states instead of the intended interpretation of interstate commerce only. Now, this trend of reading into constitutional clauses meanings that are used to justify federal government expansion has continued to this day. Now, this was pulled off the internet about 4 months ago. Reminder that U.S. v. Lopez was decided 5-4, meaning that we were a single SCOTUS vote away from giving the federal government jurisdiction over basically everything from the Commerce Clause alone. In his dissent, as Justice Breyer argued that Congress could regulate handgun possession under the Commerce Clause because gun violence could have a significant effect on interstate commerce by impairing educational environments. That's how that works. Reason 3, judicial activism. Now we're going to watch the Hamiltonian judges magically turn Jefferson's Constitution into Hamilton's Constitution. Dr. Thomas De Lorenzo writes, "Common sense suggests that it would have been the height of absurdity for the Founding Fathers to fight a revolution in the name of liberty and then turn around and write a constitution that placed everyone's liberty in the hands of 5 government lawyers with lifetime tenure. Even more irrational would have been the notion of allowing the central government to be the sole arbiter of its own powers by granting it the sole right to interpret the constitutionality of legislation through its own court system. Surely it would decide sooner or later that there were no limits to its powers." Now, Dr. Brian McClanahan asked when the U.S. Constitution died, and his reply was 1789. That year, the very first session of the federal Congress passed the Judiciary Act, which gave the Supreme Court appellate jurisdiction over state courts. In 1800, Jefferson won the presidency, and so the Hamiltonian baton was passed to one of Alexander's protégés, Chief Justice John Marshall, who began a long tradition of judicial activism. Now, Justice Marshall worked for 35 years to substitute constitutional law in place of the Constitution itself. And he began the tradition of using the Federalist Papers to help justify his decisions and rationalize the centralization of power. In 1803, the Marbury v. Madison case approved the power of the Supreme Court to determine whether or not state statutes violate the federal Constitution. Now, these review powers were eventually granted to all federal courts. Now, this granted enormous power to the Supreme Court over the states by allowing the federal courts to arbitrarily apply a constitutional test to any state law, a power, when you read the ratification debates, they were never supposed to have. Now, this also allowed them to interpret and apply their personal interpretation of the Constitution. I'm going to try this for a second. Can y'all hear me?
No.
No? You need the mic?
Yes.
All right. Not a problem. 1811, Joseph Story was sworn in as Supreme Court Justice, and he was cut from the same Hamiltonian cloth as John Marshall. And DiLorenzo notes, Story expounded the Hamiltonian superstitions of implied and resultant powers of the Constitution, championed executive power and judicial review by the federal judiciary alone, and proclaimed the supremacy of the federal government. Now, thanks to Hamilton, Marshall, and their ideological errors, Americans live under a Constitution that has been construed by federal courts for over 2 centuries, not as a restraint on the federal government as was originally intended, but as a grant of powers. Author Clinton Rossiter noted, and you can read along with me, we live and will indefinitely live under Hamilton's Constitution. Rossiter wrote in the 60s that the formula for federal congressional authority isn't the Constitution, but is now the Commerce Clause, plus the War Powers Act, plus the power to tax and spend for the general welfare, times the loosest possible reading of the Necessary and Proper Clause. The result is an unchallengeable authority to pass laws dealing with almost any problem that is national in scope. What does this look like? Well, between 1937 and 1995, not a single federal law was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Reason 4, the Lincolnian Revolution and the inversion of state versus federal power. Let's take a quick look at some definitions. Webster says a republic is a commonwealth, a state in which the exercise of sovereign power is lodged in representatives elected by the people. In modern usage, it differs from a democracy or a democratic state in which the people exercise the powers of sovereignty in person. Now, how about a federation? We don't talk a lot about federation anymore. Webster says it is in a compact between parties, particularly and chiefly between states or nations, founded on alliance by contract or mutual agreement, as a federal government such as that of the United States. The U.S. Constitution prescribed a federation of republics, not a unitary nation. The United States of America was not created as a republic. It was created as a federation of republics. The states are the republics. Okay? The federal government is not a republic. It is a federation and an apparatus created and designed to facilitate state cooperation. Now, why does this matter? The framers intended for the states to be the sentinels of liberty and the voice and champion of the people. That was the whole point of giving delineated, prescribed, enumerated powers to the federal government. You may do this and this alone. There would not have been a U.S. Constitution if there were no pre-existing states or state constitutions. Our rights were to be guaranteed and protected at the state level, and it was the states, as expressions of the political will of the people, that were sovereign, not the mass of individuals of people collectively contained within the Federation. And it was the job of the states to keep the federal government corralled. You may not know this, but despite the overwhelming and incontrovertible evidence that the states were regarded as sovereign entities from 1776 right up until 1861, Alexander Hamilton held an entirely different opinion. He was very much a nationalist and regarded the states as we would regard counties today, just some kind of arbitrary political subdivision. Now, Hamilton was a centralizer and a big government guy and held that the seat of sovereignty rested in the mass of people as individuals and not the states. And so there are massive implications for this. Abraham Lincoln was Alexander Hamilton's greatest disciple. And when Lincoln decided to invade the southern states and force them back into the Northern Union at the point of a bayonet, the excuse he used was the states weren't sovereign, the people were, and the Union was magically unbreakable. Lincoln rejected the old American ideals of self-determination, state sovereignty, and a constitutionally restrained federal government. In the prosecution for Lincoln's war, the president famously declared war without consent of Congress, suspended habeas corpus. He arrested and imprisoned tens of thousands of political opponents, including the mayor of Baltimore and a good portion of the Maryland state legislature, to prevent them from seceding. Lincoln shut down dozens of newspapers critical of his assumed powers, and he, without warrant, tapped every single telegraph line in the U.S. He illegally created the state of West Virginia. He deported a U.S. congressman and threw dozens of elections through the manipulation of the Northern Army. And it systematically disarmed hundreds of citizens in the border states. All of this in addition to the atrocities his troops committed against civilians in the South. Now, in short, Lincoln became an absolute dictator that initiated a pattern of executive tyranny and contempt for the U.S. Constitution. And later presidents like Wilson and Roosevelt would follow in his path. While he is credited with refounding America by his fans, the leviathan of federal power assumed by Lincoln has continued to grow. Tragically, in the states, the very institutions that pre-existed the Union, that were created by our forefathers to protect our rights and give us a voice and representation, were absolutely obliterated by Lincoln, and the United States transitioned away from its constitutionally prescribed structure, and the new American national government was baptized in the blood of 750,000 Americans. The United States post-1865 resulted in two new dynamics. First, the American imperial presidency proved more powerful than any European monarch ever was. And second, with state sovereignty obliterated and the consolidation of federal power realized, the concepts of checks and balances and separation of powers that we all like to tell ourselves is a real thing became absolutely meaningless. Two good quotes. General Lee, the consolidation of the states into one vast empire, sure to be aggressive abroad and despotic at home, will be the certain precursor of ruin which has overwhelmed all that preceded it. And another one from Lincoln. The American people, North and South, went into the war as citizens of the respective states. They came out as subjects, and what they just lost, they have never got back. Reason 5, 1913. The Jeffersonians ruled America from 1800 to 1861. They abolished all inland federal taxes and paid off the federal debt. They were able to do this because they understood a key to keeping government from becoming tyrannical was to limit its ability to borrow money. And 1913 was a terrible year for American liberty. The federal government was no longer satisfied with revenue from tariffs. The 16th Amendment was eventually ratified that legalized a direct income tax. And the power to tax is the power to what? Destroy. This amendment gives the federal government powerful leverage over both states and individuals. And combine this superpower, the power to destroy, with the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, and you get a recipe for unlimited federal power and the ability to control, manipulate, destroy political opponents, and declare war with impunity. Reason 6, 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, and the Incorporation Doctrine. Now, the 14th Amendment was passed in 1866 to extend the privileges of U.S. citizenship to freed African slaves, but it included an equal protection clause that was exclusively aimed at the states. Now, what was the U.S. Constitution designed for?
Sovereign states. Let states have their own control.
For the federal government, right? It was for the federal government. Well, they included an amendment that was specifically for states. This amendment changed that. The 14th Amendment was a conscious alteration of a fundamental constitutional principle that opened the door to what is referred to as the Incorporation Doctrine. Now, beginning in the 1920s, a series of Supreme Court decisions interpreted the 14th Amendment to incorporate most portions of the Bill of Rights, making these portions, for the first time, enforceable against state governments. Now, the 14th Amendment also includes something called the Equal Protection Clause. that has been extremely useful to judicial activists to expand the scope and power of the federal government, and has been interpreted to give us such things as abortion on demand, gay marriage, and a new holy canon of ever-expanding civil rights legislation. Reason 7, the 60 Civil Rights Leviathan created a second constitution. Now, this is a snippet from The Age of Entitlement by Caldwell. It's in the list of books. I recommend everybody read that. And a short quote, I'm going to read the part in yellow. Civil rights ideology, especially when it hardened into a body of legislation, became most unexpectedly the model for an entire new system of constantly churning political reform. At some point in the course of decades, which it seemed in 1964 to be merely an ambitious reform, revealed itself to be something more. The changes of the 60s, with civil rights at their core, were not just a new major element of the Constitution. They were a rival Constitution with which the original one was frequently incompatible, and the incompatibility would worsen as a civil rights regime was built out. And it's impossible to overestimate exactly how much federal energy and power have gone into enforcing this second constitution upon the states. And it's a power they were never supposed to have. And here's the kicker. It renders much of the surviving constitution null and void. And this is why the FBI seems to think it should be policing school board meetings. Every few years, the left adopts this new special class of victims and champions their cause until it turns into a new federally protected civil right. And it goes on and on and on. The natural order gets broken down and the power of the empire grows. The Constitution prescribes representative government. We do not have representative government. The only way we could achieve it is through multiple divisions of the federal government into sovereign entities, which would include Texas and a similar division of Texas into several autonomous regions similar to the cantons of Switzerland. And when it comes to government, bigger ain't better. So, Constitution now consists of 180,000 pages of federal regulations administered by 440 federal agencies by 2.5 million federal bureaucrats. So unless we're willing to roll back 223 years of American legal precedent, significantly shrink the geographical size of the United States, and reduce the size of the federal government by 99%, the Constitution that we are told limits the size and scope power of the federal government doesn't. And it's certainly not going to save us. So let's take a critical look at conservatism. 11 reasons for conservatism's failure. Conservatism has been a major political ideology since the end of World War II. And I want to ask you all again to consider, what have we as conservatives conserved? And the fact is that we all need to come to grips with the notion that the leftists that are intent on destroying our civilization have captured all of our major institutions. They have the federal government, they have mainstream media, they have academia, they have primary and secondary government schools locked up, they have the corporations, they have the financial institutions. What's left? We have a state government that hasn't been captured by leftists but is thoroughly useless, corrupt, and a lapdog of special interest. We have a state Republican Party with a few principal leaders and a decent platform, but they won't use power to advance their political agenda. And that's about it. So let's look at some reasons why conservative ideology and activism has failed. Number 1, modern conservatism that we all grew up with isn't really conservatism. The Republican political machine was captured by a neoconservative cabal in the 1970s, and as a consequence, this new political organ disavowed traditional Americanism and made peace with the liberal order. It carved out a rightist liberalism focused primarily on economics that posed no threat to the political establishment while rebranding itself as legitimate conservatism. So the term conservative has become meaningless. Number 2, influenced by this new neoconservatism, many Republicans abandoned the safeguarding of traditional Christian virtue and social consensus as well as the historic American culture and people, and became defenders of ideology. Defenders of ideology. So, hey, there's no harm in losing when you're defending ideas, right, guys? Your culture is being destroyed, your people are displaced, but at least we still have our principles. The essence of politics is the acquisition and use of power. But conservatives have an aversion to using power. They prefer to rely on debate, procedure, and a vestige of their neoconservative pedigree. And they seek consensus and not necessarily victory, and are happy being, as Sam Francis has called them, beautiful losers. Number 4. The movement attempted to advance conservatism through libertarian notions of small government, low taxes, and personal liberty, which are objectives for peacetime, not wartime. And make no mistake, we are at war with the left, ladies and gentlemen. New conservatism is inherently defensive philosophy and is an approach that inevitably results in managed decline, makes zero sense when we're undergoing a progressive revolution. Now, Robert Conquest's second law of politics says that any organization not explicitly right-wing sooner or later becomes left-wing. Maintaining a civilization requires active processes and a constant expenditure of energy. It isn't passive. This can't be done solely with legislation. It has to be maintained at a social and cultural level. Yet modern conservatives are preoccupied with ideology and legislation, and while they neglect their people and their culture. Conservatives have failed to understand the nature of liberal progressivism. It's a one-way revolutionary ratchet that destroys social order and brings cultural chaos, individual powerlessness, and statism. It can only be stopped by destroying it. The average conservative citizen isn't engaged in politics and believes voting is a sum of his duty. He wants to be left alone. The average left-wing person is sold out and committed to bringing change and will donate time, money, and energy to winning. The people that want to win will beat the people that just want to be left alone every single time. Conservative activists should be measuring success and failure by the cultural shift of the Overton window on various social and cultural issues, and not by legislative activity. We're still spiking the ball over constitutional carry, while our children are being groomed by institutionally protected sex predators. Premillennial dispensational theology, which came to the U.S. in the early 20th century, has taught conservative Christians to believe that the return of Jesus is imminent. It's any day now, and that the world is in a dark, irreversible decline. And the phrase, "why polish brass on a sinking ship," has been the guiding political principle for many American Christians for 4 generations. Any Christian theology that teaches or excuses political or social inaction or is used to reinforce helplessness in the face of evil is heretical. And you can be a dispensationalist and still fulfill your God-given duty to stand against evil and protect your people. In an effort to prevent the rise of strong social forces that would create a tyrant similar to what mid-20th century Europe experienced, the modern conservative movement adopted the post-war consensus. It's a social program created by the federal government after World War II to purposefully engineer a weak and open society. Through economic globalization, mass immigration, deconstruction of local and regional identities, and the use of critical theory, conservatives went along with progressives that sought to deprive traditional Americans of the strong cultural ties of nationalism and populism and ethnic identity and religious tradition. Open society ideals were recast as the new American values. So the big picture here is our ideology, ladies and gentlemen, have failed us in every way. So now that the Constitution is off the table and our go-to political philosophy is failing, there are a few ways that we can beat back tyranny in the short term under this political system. Number one is raise your hand if you've heard of the lesser magistrate. All right, got a few of y'all here. It's an interposition of an official between the people and a despotic higher ruler. We occasionally see Ron DeSantis using this in Florida against the federal government. Now, there's a great potential here for this as a collaborative effort between GOP governors and states that still have real elections, but until we start electing statesmen to office in Texas instead of attorneys and judges, we won't see this widely used. Nullification means to ignore the laws you want to. It has worked historically and recently. When implemented on a large scale, such as a statewide nullification, the feds are powerless to stop it. Texas independence. A little bit of trivia here. Before 1850, northern states threatened to secede from the Union on 5 different occasions. Yes, the Union was created to be a voluntary compact. But I can make this real simple for everyone. Secession or Texas independence is simply political self-determination. And despite what Jeff Leach says, there isn't anything more American than political self-determination. Now, is this popular? Yeah, wildly so. A political majority of Texans actually want to be able to vote on this. Now, is it feasible right now? Well, the Texas legislature can't even muster up the courage to protect their own border. Until we get a legislative makeover, this remains the best solution that our champions in Austin won't want us to have. Reversing the Marxist dialectical ratchet. And this means stopping the leftward drift in the Overton window and pushing it the other way. We went from what happens between 2 consenting adults in the privacy of their own bedroom to trans kids and Antifa-protected family drag queen shows in less than 10 years. Now, people on the right have got to figure this out and begin reversing the ratchet. For those of you who are involved in politics here at a local level, purge the RPT of establishment loyalists. Moderate Republicans and Democrats in Texas work together, in case y'all haven't figured that out yet, to defeat conservatives, and this must end. Purge county Republican organizations of establishment loyalists. The uniparty establishment is currently attempting to purge conservatives from the county parties and local organizations, and we need a counteroffensive. New RPT rules to punish Republican office holders who buck the party and grassroots activists. Censor them. We got Rule 44. That ain't enough. Rule 44 ain't enough, y'all. Kick them out of the party. Convert from popular electoral primaries, where for the last 20 years, 95% of the incumbents have been elected year after year after year. Can convert from popular electoral primaries to state convention primaries. Pass term limits. Reform the speakership once the legislature has been purged of all these loyalists. Number 8, avoid amnesty measures at all costs. The passage of amnesty means game over for Texas, and we are one amnesty away from becoming California overnight. One amnesty away from becoming California overnight. Y'all need to understand that. The border is open for a reason. And while the right tries to avoid being called racist at all costs, the left is waging demographic warfare. Every border state has fallen, and they fall for a reason. I'm going to shift some gears here. I'm going to hit on one of 2 key concepts that is going to be new to most of you. Talk about the mutual decomposition of our social fabric and political structure over time. So let's recap. Constitution is gone. Conservatism doesn't really work. It's just progressivism going the speed limit. We currently have no quick and easy fixes for what's going on. So what do? Remember when we talked about reason 1, but the Constitution being dead, is we aren't the same people that created the Constitution. Well, let's look at how our change in political structure has mirrored the change in our society over 2 centuries. And what we'll discover, if we look real closely, and this is the key to finding our way back out of this mess, there's a relationship here between our fabric and our government. There we go. 1865, U.S. functioned as a federation of constitutional republics. The states operated on natural law, which was a Christian English common law, and they had an intact Anglo-Protestant social fabric and an unquestioned identity as an Anglo-American nation. They knew who they were, and they had a social fabric. 1865 to 64, U.S. functioned as a unitary nation with federal law reigning supreme, and the constitutional law increasingly having very little to do with the original Constitution. The federal government became the guarantor of natural rights, and our social fabric began to tear. So note here, we exchanged natural law for natural rights. That's a big swap there. We swapped a duty for an entitlement. Duty for an entitlement. It's a bad swap. We began to lose our identity as a distinct people while America was reimagined as a propositional nation of liberty and opportunity for all people. From 1964 to today, the U.S. functions as a global economic empire ruled by a bureaucratic managerial regime. The federal government, together with corporations and NGOs, have pledged to it. You think Joe Biden runs a government?
No.
Pledged to advance a progressive global civil rights agenda while our social fabric has been destroyed by our very own federal government through mass immigration and ill-conceived social experimentation. America is now a global guarantor of civil rights. That's our justification for the billions over to Ukraine, because we have to guarantee the Ukrainians their civil rights. How do we go from an Anglo-Protestant federation of republics to a global crusade for trans kids? Hierarchy, structure, political power have been squeezed out of our social fabric and replaced with state-enforced universal liberalism. Again, we exchange something good for something rotten. And when we give up the particular for the universal, we lose. So we're going to segue into our second key concept here, the relationship between increasing individual rights, statism, and tyranny. So what explains this phenomenon, this loss of liberty that is inversely proportional to the increase of statism? But Patrick Deneen offers an answer in his book, Why Liberalism Failed. He explains that liberalism's ascent required sustained efforts to undermine the classical and Christian understandings of liberty, the disassembling of widespread norms, traditions, and practices, and perhaps above all, with the reconceptualization of the primacy of the individual defined in isolation from arbitrary accidents of birth, with the state, this is the key part, with the state as the main protector of individual rights and liberty. So let me ask you a question. Where does the government get the money that it spends? All right, I'll follow up with the second question. Where does the government get its power from? Hold that thought. Hold that thought. It gets its money from us. Where does it get its power from? As America matured, her citizens cast off traditional ties, social structure, and according to the tenets of liberalism, were slowly and methodically deconstructed into a body of deracinated individuals. Liberalism acted as a corrosive solvent to dissolve our social bonds. As people's demand to be protected and liberated through an ever-increasing array of government rules, regulations, as well as state-enforced rights, here's the kicker: the individual has become powerless, and the state has become all-powerful. So let's revisit the previous question. Where did the state get this power from? From the things that have been destroyed and leveled by the state in the ongoing crusade for more freedom, more rights, more equality. The intermediate social structures, church, family, tribal, regional loyalties, community. Community is a big one. Fraternities, civic societies. All of these have been gutted by the state and emptied of their power, which subsumed it. And rather than being free and enjoying ever-increasing amounts of liberty, which is what the lie we tell ourselves, citizens are in essence stripped of their identity, their relationships, their very humanity, while subjected to a domineering totalitarian state. So fighting back. The right-wing base of the Republican Party of Texas has no strategic plan to win. They have a political platform they can't implement because they have to rely on their political enemies to use it. The majority of legislative office holders with R behind their name are your enemies. Now, this is the Texas House. Over here, I'm going to buzz through these slides real quick. Over here on, this won't show up. Over here, the red area is conservatives. The left is a progressive area, along with the yellow area and the little green. Those are progressives. These people were progressives this session. These people are here were conservative. So notice the change in scale. How progressive are the progressives compared to the conservatives?
Very.
How many conservatives are there?
Not many.
Not many at all. Now let me show you something that's going to infuriate you. That's the division of the party right there, guys. We've got more progressive Republicans than we have conservative Republicans in the Texas House, and that's a big problem. The RPT's elected officials have had control of the Texas legislature for 20 years and couldn't conserve the ladies' restroom. We're all stuck in this cycle of learned political helplessness, like a Republican version of Stockholm Syndrome, and it's time we stop losing. So how do we do that? How do we fight back against an all-powerful state when the political avenues seem closed and are frustrating? Well, not by fighting back as individuals in a rigged political system. We fight by building back what liberalism has destroyed, and we take our power back from the state. And that's one of the most important things I'm going to read for y'all this afternoon. This is by Sam Francis, published in 1994. A new, radical, middle American right need not abandon its efforts, but consistent with its recognition that it is laying siege to a hostile establishment, it ought to realize that political action in a cultural power vacuum will largely be futile. The main focus of a middle American right should be the reclamation of cultural power, the patient elaboration of an alternative culture within but against the regime. The middle American right should be working in and with schools, churches, clubs, women's groups, youth organizations, civic and professional associations, military and police forces, and even in the much dreaded labor unions to create a radicalized middle American consciousness that can perceive the ways in which the exploitation of the middle class is institutionalized and understand how it can be resisted. Only when this kind of infrastructure and cultural hegemony is developed can a middle American right seek meaningful political power without coalitions with the left and bargaining with the regime. So friends, power enjoyed by the middle class has always been exercised and distributed through hierarchical structures and intermediate institutions, through the church, the home, the family, community, tribal, regional affiliations, professional and civic societies. Without these institutions, we have no political power. Without those institutions, we have no political power and are consigned to perpetual political frustration and loss. And by rebuilding these institutions, citizens can create an interlocking network that provides a local hedge against state and corporate tyranny and oppression by building bases of popular support, political legitimacy, and distributing local power across a wide, multi-layered network. Now, there are two types of power. There's hard power and soft power. And hard power is kinetic and it's force, it's coercive. Soft power is the power to co-opt and persuade. We want to accrue local soft power by being involved in our communities and being a solution to our people's problems, working along a horizontal axis. And so here's some action items I know y'all were waiting on. Number one, rebuild the household. Once jobs were available in factories or homes, the places where boys learned to become men, fathers, where girls learned to become women and mothers, where faith and tradition was handed down from generation to generation, our homes simply became hotels, as fathers and eventually mothers both became workers commissioned to build the 20th century Western corporate empire. Our children were deprived of their parents and were carted off to government schools to learn how to be good producers and consumers. The household is the fundamental unit of society, not the individual, not the individual. And every level of social organization should be oriented around protecting the household and the generation-to-generation transfer of faith and tradition. Strong homes are a hedge against a tyrannical state. Rebuilding a tribe. Now, tribes are collections of households united by not only ethnicity, but tradition and proximity, and form the basis of high trust, high affinity communities. Humans live in relation to one another, and despite the illusion, courtesy of our post-war consensus, that tribalism is bad is an unavoidable reality hardwired into the fabric of creation by God. You can go to any kindergarten cafeteria at lunchtime and see tribalism at work. All of us have fond memories of the people that we grew up with, cousins, aunts, uncles, extended relatives, close friends we went to school with. And you can look at church demographics and housing stats, and all of these conclusively demonstrate that Americans, contrary to our very own protest, are tribal. Now, tribal identities help shape how we view the world and how we believe the world should be governed. And in fact, they are the strongest predictor of political affiliation. Rebuild communities. The average American moves 11.4 times within a lifetime. We must become a rooted people again. A people tied to the land, a people that value their local and regional identities, that form low-time preference, high-trust relationships with our neighbors. Churches. American Christianity is a mess, and churches must reject the temptation to be cosmopolitan and worldly, and we should resume the teaching of the Lordship of Christ, the obedience of the moral law as a duty, and traditional Christian ethics. Civic societies. We need community leaders coming together to form organizations and societies that look after the best interests of the people and build local power. We need societies that are specifically tasked with looking after the basic needs and economic interests in the community. Every community should have a community Christian leadership council that takes stock of the local churches, the spiritual health of the community. Think of a modern-day village elder. And a CLC would be composed of godly churchmen and church officers be tasked with reestablishing local moral authority in the community. CLC would promote and defend virtue within the community and help struggling churches find good pastors and help expand the availability of Christian education in the community. So that's the horizontal axis, just some ideas. Let's talk about the vertical axis and coercive power. So we are in the spot principally that we are in because we as a people have no leadership, and we rely on political jingoisms, rigged procedures, impotent political philosophies while bouncing around as a mass of powerless individuals. We have no effective political leadership, no right-wing cultural leadership, and no spiritual leadership. And that must change if we want better politics. And while conservatives believe that the power rests with we the people, the iron rule of oligarchy explains that we will always have powerful elites ruling over us. It's not whether we will have elites ruling over us, but which. And so we're familiar with the bad elites throughout history. And our democratic political system has given us the worst possible type of elite, a crony capitalist that are absolved from any responsibility or ties to the people they rule over through corrupt proxies holding elected office. And you would think we would catch on, but these proxies get reelected 95% of the time. So how do you take these men on? You fight them with good elites, and you break their system. Only power can check power, and elites can fight other elites. Now, the good elites are men with exceptional talent and virtue and resources, and they feel an obligation to help their fellow man. And there's an old Norman phrase, noblesse oblige, that refers to the obligation that men of high standing have towards those around them and under their care. Good elites are men to get behind, and these are men that deserve the support from the RPT's base, and they can enlarge it. And good elites serve as a rallying point for the people. They inspire, they command, and they have the affection of the people, and they interpose for them because they have virtue. And that's what we're missing. A red Caesar, when assuming power of the state, could challenge and displace the corrupt political establishment. He could permanently defeat the leftist revolution within our border and lay the groundwork for an entirely new political order, one that has an accountable leadership. The possibilities are limitless, but there'll be no change in our status quo until the people are integrated horizontally and vertically. So where does this power come from? This power that would propel this machine? Let's talk about that. It's time we realize that patching up this broken system with good candidates only buys us time. Even if Texas had a governor that was as bold and effective as DeSantis, the fact remains the left isn't going to leave us alone and let us have nice things. They will continue to use any tool at their disposal. Now let's get real for a minute. Any existing political system that requires bills ending the murder of children, stopping transgenderism or sodomy, or shutting down an open border to be debated, to be rationally deliberated and voted on, not really a system worth saving. When our traditions of governments require us to share power with demons, subject ourselves to ever-increasing doses of cultural cancer every election cycle when we attempt to protect our children from predators but are hamstrung by deviants shrieking about civil rights, maybe it's time we do something different. And I'll go even further. Any government that fails to protect its people from tyranny that we experienced during the pandemic, from the ongoing invasion and deadly anarchy at the border, is illegitimate. And if the people voting were actually paying attention, they would have removed their consent long ago from both the federal and the state governments. Most of the Texas legislature should have been frog marched out of the Pink Dome for their criminal neglect of duty and banned from serving in public office during the pandemic. Both institutions have failed us. So our elites need an organization that connects them vertically and horizontally with a hierarchy of good men at the local and regional level. They need an organization and a plan. One that isn't afraid to describe the status quo for what it is, and here's the kicker, willing to use hard power to change it. Hard power rewards friends and punishes enemies. Winning is far more important than losing on principle when you are in war. So where does this energy come from? There's an incredibly insightful saying that Charles Haywood uses that is attributed to a Spanish philosopher named Jose Ortega y Gasset, and it says, "Force follows public opinion." Any right-wing political movement worth its salt must hitch its wagon to the middle-class struggle and champion their cause. And Texas is in dire need of a new political movement, and one that would draw strength from a strong pro-middle-class economic agenda and social agenda, a Texas-first nationalistic populism that would seek to defeat the control the left has over Texas institutions, wrest sovereignty away from an inept federal government, and put the globalists on notice that Texas will not bow a knee to their designs. A movement that draws attention to the ills of our homes and families, that brings sane solutions to the moral anarcho-tyranny in our communities, has real solutions, would have enormous support with the right messaging that would extend far beyond to traditional GOP base. Now, your average middle-class Texan couldn't care less about the free market, limited government, or tax cuts for corporations. They're having a hard time putting food on the table and can't afford medical care. They can't scrape up enough money for a down payment on a home, much less think about owning a few acres. Our children are inheriting an economy void of a middle class. Their jobs are being shipped overseas. Their communities are ravaged by corporate raiders and scheming leftist ideologues. And now they're being demographically replaced by illegal aliens while state government sits on its hands. The people are unplugged from the political process in Texas because no one speaks to them. This new movement would not only involve itself in the current broken electoral system, but could create a parallel political system that would replace it. Our politics should reflect reality. And wrapping up here, until the good guys have sufficient organizational structure in place that can challenge the failed status quo, elites ready to lead and use hard power to force change, we have to think locally, act locally, get involved, build, organize, be impossible to control, difficult to cancel, and hard to kill. The future will belong to those that are planning and building now and possess the will to win. Thank you.